Hi, everyone. My name is David Drever. I'm a Microsoft MVP and a Associate Director with Protiviti, specializing in the records management and information protection space.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joanne Klein. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, owner of my own consulting company, Next Novus, and I work in the Purview compliance set of tools with my customers. So we're here today for another episode of Compliance Unplugged. What do you want to talk about today, Dave?
So, something I hear a lot and is everyone has this definition of what is a record. And I think it's changed over the years. So I think why don't we tackle that one today? Why don't we talk about what is a record in respect to Microsoft Purview, Microsoft 365?
That's a great idea. So why don't you kick it off and tell me what you think of when you think of a record?
That's great. So for me, it's always been a changing thing, because if you think back to it, before we had electronic records management and things were more like, file shares were nothing more than just a place to store your files. A record was a physical document you had to print out that was available to everyone. They didn't have, because before it had websites and things like that. So it had this physical, connotation to it. So when you printed it out, it was official. It needed to be a record. And so they only printed out some information. So you think about it from a standard organization that everyone has, an HR benefits package or employee records, things like that. That's what was defined as a record. But all of the other stuff wasn't. All the stuff that you use to build reports and all the information, it was just documentation. It didn't have a record connection to it. And what I've been finding is that while everything, I guess I would say, is that the things are blurring. While everything may not necessarily be considered a record, everything has a retention schedule to it. Before, your records were the only things that really had a retention schedule, but now everything has to have a retention schedule, because if it doesn't, you run into overload of information. You have information is kept too long. You run out of storage space. But that's my take. What do you think, Joanne?
Right, I agree. There's the purest definition of a record as seen from a records management view. It provides business value or historical value, or you're keeping it for legal or regulatory means. And I think some of those things were easier to identify in the paper-based world. We have lots of capabilities to also do it in the digital world, but it's compounded by the sheer volume of digital content we have now, and then all of the types of content we have as well. Is a record a Teams channel conversation? Is a record, just a file sitting in somebody's SharePoint, or dare I say OneDrive location? There's so many things that make records management and the definition of what an organization considers a record really complex in today's world, I think.
Yeah, and actually, a good point to your what you said before there is that the massive amount of digital content is astronomical. Like, if you think about it from this perspective, back in the physical days, you had a filing cabinet. It only had so much space, and every person can see how much space there was left. Same thing with a file room. You only had so much space. Today, the storage space is hidden. No one knows.
It is.
For admins.
Yes, you could have a perfectly clean desk, but have tens of thousands of records that under your domain in any given day at work, and you can't even tell, really. Other than sometimes it gets hard to find things. That's kind of where the problem surfaces itself to office workers is, I can't find that document. I'm just going to create a new one or copy last month's one, and then this is why managing these digital records can become fairly challenging.
100%. Yeah, agreed. So I understand, when we look at it, so Microsoft does have a take, and there's a life cycle. So should we maybe talk about that a little bit, I think, eh?
Sure.
So I think we have something to show with that.
We do. So I want to frame this conversation by talking about the life cycle of a record. And this, in fact, hasn't really changed from the paper-based to the digital world when you think about it at this very high level. Right? You create your record, or you're maybe sent a copy of something in email, and that's kind of the start of the whole life cycle. And then it proceeds through the remaining part of its life cycle, where it's there's kind of an active phase. Sometimes there's an inactive phase. I believe that part was maybe a little bit easier to work with in the paper-based world, although there are some options. And then, of course, last is the disposition phase. So what do you think? Have we captured the life cycle of a record accurately?
Yeah, it really hasn't changed. Like if you think about it like that, like to your point though, the only one that's kind of blurred a little bit is probably the active and inactive phase, right?
Yeah.
When you think about the paper-based records, the active phase moved from a filing cabinet to a file room or something offsite, right?
That's right.
You don't have that necessarily anymore, but you still have that concept.
That's right. And I sometimes see active and inactive split out in customers' retention schedules. So often they're from kind of years ago.
Especially if they're record-based, right?
Yeah. So let's kind of showcase a little bit more about these phases with a focus on Microsoft 365 and Purview and all of the different capabilities that are there. How about I take number one and then I'll pass it over to you to number two.
Sounds good.
Okay. So lots of ways content gets into Microsoft 365. You can, of course, create something. You can, upload a file from, some other repository. You can receive emails. You can send emails. Lots of ways content can be created, basically, that kicks off the start of that life cycle. Now, on the bottom, this is where Microsoft has many, many features. And this certainly is not a complete list, but these are just some things we thought of off the kind of top of our minds. Anything you do in the Microsoft 365 locations can potentially be considered a business record, where maybe a decision is made or there's some conversation around something that's very strategic and has some value to your business. You can bring in external content from other data connectors. SharePoint Premium is clearly in this start of the life cycle, where you can generate content, you can extract metadata out of documents and forms that you get. Really a powerful solution to automate kind of the content lifecycle here. And of course, the Power Platform tools can be used to do all kinds of things as well.
Absolutely. And which brings us into the active phase. So you've got the content into your locations, and what do you do with it now? Well, every user I've ever talked to, myself, you want to collaborate with others. And so you want to be able to use those tools. So whether you're using SharePoint and you're sharing it from using, SharePoint as your golden record, and you share from there, give people access to that content and they all work in one place, which is the preferable way of doing it. You can, horrible to say, but you could email it out and do updates and send it back, which is not good. We don't recommend that. That is bad.
But it happens.
It happens. But the reason it's bad, just maybe as an aside, is because you're creating duplicates of that content. You're losing that control, right? So you want to make sure you maintain that under your own control. But while you're in these locations, whether it's SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams or Exchange, you have your controls for security. You have your controls for protection with sensitivity labels and DLP and things like that. And you have your retention controls, which we're here about today. Being able to apply retention and controls on that content, and being able to declare things as a record or whether it's not a record, whether it's dynamic data that you just need to keep updated. You need to make sure that file copy is still there. You don't have this concept of maintaining every version of the document as a record. That's a necessity in some cases, but you don't always have to have that. But you still, in this active phase, you still need to have that ability to retain your content.
Yeah. I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go.
I was going to say the active phase, I think, is really turning traditional records management up on its head a little bit, because you're trying to manage records right in the same space that end users are collaborating, and that can be a challenge sometimes. Little bit about inactive phase. Don't want to dwell on this one, but this is when content is no longer being actively worked on. Now, some of this can fall into the it's redundant, obsolete, or trivial, so we can just simply get rid of it. But some of the content, and particularly if it's a record, you can't. So some organizations may want to do something different with content after it's in its active phase. Not always. This is kind of an optional phase, I think, in the digital world, but there's some capabilities. Microsoft Archive is one. I think that is in public preview right now, or is that private preview?
I think it's private preview. I could be
Okay.
wrong. Yeah.
And it stores content that might be in SharePoint in just a cheaper storage location, but still adheres to the retention controls that you have applied to it. So that would be one use case anyway for an inactive phase if you chose to manage your content in that phase. Yeah.
I'm kind of two minds here, especially when it comes to SharePoint Archive. While I see the benefit of it for especially long term, one of the draws for me for Microsoft Purview retention over other tools is that it's in place. You don't have to move it to other locations.
Right.
From the place that you create that content to the place you dispose of that content, it doesn't move. So people always know where to find it.
Yeah.
Moving it to another location, an archive site or something along that line, or seeing, I think that with the archive solution, that might be a little bit of a blurred line there as well.
Yeah.
But I do like the concept of keeping your records where they always have been for the entire life cycle. That's just my take on it.
Yeah, I have heard some record managers wanting it to be in a place where only they have read access. That would be one, I guess, use case for it. But there's pros and cons to that.
Yeah.
So then end users, either they don't have access or maybe they just have read access from that point in time. This, I think, speaks to why you kind of need to holistically design your whole end-to-end life cycle for your records. So you as an organization know, yes, we're going to move all of our stuff to an archive location, or no, we're leaving it as is, and just making everything read-only, let's say.
100%.
Yeah. Okay, over to you.
All right, and this brings us to the disposition phase. What do you want to do when the retention is over? And so do you want to destroy it? Do you want to review it and destroy it? And what happens when you choose just destroy it? It's gone. You can't, it's being disposed of outside of your not outside your control, because you set that control. But what 9 times out of 10 that I see from all clients I work with is the concept of a disposition review. I will make a quick caveat around this. If you do not have an E5 license, you do not get disposition reviews. You have to have that E5. So just be sure that if you want to do this, you have an E5 license to do that with. Now, that goes along with Power Automate flow as well, I believe. You can't get outside that without an E5. Now moving to Power Automate, what they've brought in this year is you actually can completely customize your disposition process with the Power Automate flow. You just tell the label that's what you want it to do. Another option is you can do a daisy chain. So for instance, like maybe if a document hasn't been modified in a year or 6 months or something, whatever the number is, that's when it becomes a record in your organization. So you daisy chain. You have a standard retention label, which we'll talk about here shortly in a second. And when it hasn't been touched in 6 months, okay, we figure it's a record, so we're going to daisy chain that into a record label.
Yeah.
And so you have that capability there too. And then, as we kind of mentioned before, Microsoft Archive. So those who have very long-term dispositions or permanent retention, you want to archive that. So that is an option as well.
Yeah.
So I thought, Joanne, you kind of talked about here earlier. Why don't we talk about what it looks like in Microsoft Purview when it comes to these different types of records and things like that?
Yes. And as a matter of fact, one of the first things I often have a conversation with records managers about is what Microsoft means when they call something a record retention label, because it's a little bit, maybe different than what a records manager would expect. So go for it. Explain what that is in Purview.
Well, okay, so let's see if we agree. So my take on it is you have 2 ways of looking at it. So Microsoft provides 2 categories for records retention. They have what I call a dynamic label or a non-static label. And what that is that the intent of this document is that it's dynamic. It's always changing. It's a report. You're modifying it, or it's that kind of idea. But you don't necessarily need to keep all the versions of that document. You just need to make sure the most recent document is available to you. So how Microsoft treats that is it's fully open, and it just makes sure that the document itself cannot be fully deleted.
Yeah.
But then you have the record retention label. And so what the record retention label does is it locks it down. It makes that version that you have declared a record immutable. It doesn't mean you can't change the document. What you're doing is you're changing different versions of that document, and then you make that version immutable as well with the record label. So you are saying it's kind of a mixture of the standard and the non-standard, or a record label. But what you need to remember is that every version that you deem as a record at that point in time becomes immutable and maintained that way in the system. What about you, Joanne? What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I've never actually heard that description of static versus dynamic. That's great. Often I spend quite a bit of time explaining the end user experience with what these record labels look like. So a record label is just actually a tick box when you're creating the label. That's really all it is. And it gives the label these certain properties that when applied to content makes it immutable. So it does have an end user impact that I always want to make sure that records managers know, because some records managers come to the table and they want everything to be a record retention label. So just kind of understanding the risk of all of your business records and the experience from the end user side, and which ones should truly be a record retention label and which ones can just be a dynamic label, as you say.
That's just,
yeah.
I have a way with words.
Yeah, don't you ever.
All right. Well, that's been a great conversation. It's always this is something that comes up all the time with clients I talk to and other people and stuff like that. So it's great to kind of get out there, and thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.